Welcome to the Legacy Leaders Podcast. Are you doing the best for your client to help them create their legacy? Are you creating a plan that goes far beyond finances to help people ensure that it becomes the driving force behind all decisions? On this podcast, hosts Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller will help you with growing your practice and your clients' peace of mind. Together, they bring the best and brightest minds to share with you how to help your clients develop their best legacy. And now, here are your hosts, Katie Beth and Stan.
Welcome to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with your hosts, Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. Our guest today is attorney and estate planner, insurance professional, and public speaker, Zale Dowlen. Zale, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Thanks, Katie Beth.
So to just dive right in, you have just a very unique background in kind of several different industries. Why don't you give our listeners just the 2-minute overview of how it is that you came to be a part of each of these different industries and what kind of sparked your interest in things like estate planning?
Sure. So real quick, my elevator pitch is that I help people to live well and be remembered as the heroes they already are. And when we unpack that, for me, it's really looking more at low and middle net worth people. When COVID hit and I looked at what I enjoyed doing and who I enjoyed doing it with and wanted the ability to do it in my office, it meant rolling back a lot of the litigation that I did. And some of it I enjoyed, some of it I didn't really enjoy. I saw it really more as from a ministry perspective more than anything. But what could I do in my office? What could I help average folks who were really underserved? And so I started looking at estate planning from that perspective. And it wasn't so much the high end estate planning where we're doing elaborate trust and that sort of thing, but just the basic stuff, just the meat and potato stuff for everyday folks. And I had some folks coming in from different streams from that. And then I looked at, how can we take that to the next level? What else can serve these people? And so that's when I really started taking a hard look, and I practiced for my faith and really felt like the Lord led me in this of looking at what insurance products fits their needs, especially when we've got people who are aging, maybe they're in the decumulation phase of their life. What does it look like for long-term care, Medicaid type products and Medicare products as well? And so what did that look like? And so looking at it from an attorney perspective, I had to figure out, how does that work? How does that fit? And basically it's just a disclaimer form. Somebody doesn't come in looking for a will, walk out with a whole life policy and not understand the difference, right? So that's really where all that fit in. And recently I had a speaking event where we talked on a lot of these things, and the organizer used a term for me that I don't think I've heard before, because she referred to me as a bit of a unicorn. And she's not wrong, but it's fit well with really that target demographic.
I love that. That's great. And I love that you brought up your tagline. That was actually one of the questions I had for you. I love be remembered as the hero you already are. And for those of you listening, if you check out Zale's website, we'll give you that here in a few minutes. It has this incredible picture of a father and daughter and just really gives you all of the warm feels. So that was a great elevator pitch. Besides just estate planning and all of those things that you do, I noticed that you also do some personal injury law and some church planning as well. Tell us about those and what are the unique challenges you have working in each of these different areas?
Sure. So let's unpack personal injury real quick. As Stan and I were talking earlier, I have some connections with Central Arkansas. And one of those connections is that I started out as an insurance adjuster while I was working on my master's at University of Arkansas in Little Rock. And so I have my previous career is that of an insurance adjuster. And so as I went through law school, which is one of those things where I work during the day, went at night, I really anticipated getting out of law school and being one of those personal injury heavy hitters. And when I got out, I found a few things that were unique. So first of all, people had a hard time feeling like they could trust me because I was a previous adjuster, even though it didn't seem to resonate that I didn't work for the companies anymore. My perspective on it was, hey, I have some inside information that could really help you, but for most people that didn't fit. And I also figured out that I really hated fighting over money. So that wasn't the greatest fit, at least for, a full practice. What I do now is I do have some personal injury cases. I have another firm that assists me with those. The value add that I bring is typically any firm that's going to do a lot of personal injury is going to do a fair amount of volume. And sometimes it's hard to get through to those attorneys and that staff and that sort of thing. And so what I offer my clients, and full disclaimer, this is for Tennessee only, what I offer my clients is, that point of contact, that understanding of the way the claims process works. And yes, if it's taking longer than you expect, here's why, and an avenue to really get those answers. So
That's good stuff.
And you mentioned one other. What was the other one?
And your church planning. Tell us
Sure.
about your background with church planning.
Sure. So, my entire life, I have done something somewhere with churches. I've had great experiences. I've been burned. I know both sides of that. I am a Christian Legal Society attorney. I'm an Alliance Defending Freedom attorney. There's a couple of other networks in there as well. But when it comes to what a church wants to do or doesn't want to do, I've got great access to the people who have all the right answers. I don't profess to have all the right answers. I just profess that I've got access to those networks. And so that's typically the way that works out. That's certainly not an income leader for the office. More than anything, it's ministry, which is really what that boils down to.
So I'm curious, so what kind of, give us a couple of examples of the kinds of issues that you would grapple with in that role.
Sure. So we're talking about the church role, right, Stan?
Yep. Yeah.
Okay. So for example, one of the more recent ones was a church that was effectively dying. They had some property, they had some new people come in, and so basically they were in a position to where they just really wanted to hand the keys and the leadership over to some of the new folks. And the average person going into that goes, okay, great, we just changed the name, changed the affiliation, move forward. Well, Stan, as you know, sometimes you need to get and look at deed restrictions on that, right?
Yeah.
Maybe that land was gifted to them so long as they're a Baptist church, or maybe it's a deal where the denomination has some ties in there. And so maybe the denomination owns the land, and if they want to start their own thing, they're just going to have to walk away from it. And so that's one of my more recent ones that's been a lot of fun to work with. I also have served on several security teams for churches. And so that's a bit of a fascination for me, as well as what's the best way to be first responders? What's the best way to serve in an ever-changing environment whenever that sort of thing comes up?
Tell me a little bit more about that. I'm not quite sure when you say
the security.
Security. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you've got a situation now where we're in a climate where maybe somebody has an inclination to attack a church.
Yeah.
Or more commonly, a situation to where you've got a non-custodial parent who wants to come in and do a snatch and grab of a child and uses the church as their forum to do that. What does that look like? What does that look like from a church administrative perspective? What does it look like from a policy perspective? What does it look like from a hands-on perspective? And you have to pay attention to not only what state you're in, but what county you're in. You have to pay attention to what do the various insurance policies afford and not afford, all that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, if you've got a security group, a first responder group that is put together well, that is well trained, that is coming at this from a primarily a verbal de-escalation perspective beyond anything else. When you look at it from the legal perspective, and so for example, with Tennessee, we have some certain attorney general opinions that have been fantastic when it's come to church security. All that sort of thing, put all that in that mix, and a lot of times it looks very different than what your average security team looks like. We have to weed out those that are just looking for a reason to be assertive or be aggressive. We need to pull in.
So wait, so Zale, when you're talking about security team, are you talking about church members themselves?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Now you can take, especially for the larger churches, it may be a situation to where you want to pay some off-duty officers to come in, but in every scenario that I have seen, that has been understaffed. So what does it look like for us to include our first responders? You're going to have a medical emergency generally more than you're going to have some sort of a security issue. And the same people who are the shepherds or the watchdogs for the church, they need to be looking out for those medical emergencies. How do we get an ambulance in and out? Do we have the ability to get an ambulance in and out? How do we pool our first responders? Do we have an AED mounted in the foyer where people can find it? Do we have fire extinguishers mounted? All that sort of stuff weaves in. And so a lot of times people will come in with a security mindset, and they'll be thinking, okay, well, I want people who can carry and all that sort of thing. Well, no. A lot of times the folks who have that mindset are honestly the ones we want to weed out, because, they may put us in a defensive situation that we never should have been in. We want the caregivers and the people who understand what it means to deal with people who are triggered, with people who are coming in an assertive, selfish mindset, and how do we serve them as a church, and how do we serve our flock?
Okay, so if somebody listening to this podcast, has some role to play, like they're on the board of deacons or the church board, whatever, if they were interested in developing an approach to this for their congregation, you're somebody they could reach out to?
Yes, I enjoy having those conversations. They need to understand if they're coming from outside of Tennessee, that I'm going to speak from my Tennessee law license, but that doesn't mean that I can't give general overview advice.
I find this also fascinating because of my background coming from being on staff at a megachurch, and actually there we had both. So our staff, and particularly me, because I was in charge of children's ministry, our entire staff was actually trained in this. They would take us out several times a year. They would walk us through and teach us how to clear corners in the church. I mean, it was all of it. So it kind of ranged from working on policies and things like that all the way through. They eventually had me where I was wired up with a mic like a security guard every time I had kids in the building, because we were able to reach out to the off-duty officers that we had and the first responders that we had there. So very fascinating, and I love that you include that type of thing in the church planning that you do. I think your average person who attends church on a Sunday morning doesn't even realize that a security team is. Even my parents' tiny church just down the road, my dad is on the security team for that, and their church has like 50 people in it. And so I think your average person doesn't realize. But the most important thing I think that you said is pointing out that it's not about being aggressive. It's not about that type of defensiveness. It's really more about somebody who can de-escalate that situation, because at the end of the day, that's what you really want. And that's what we always taught everyone was, this is not about you jumping out and being a hero. We have off-duty officers for that. That's why they're here. This is about protecting everyone else and really, being a loving caregiver as much as you can and de-escalating that situation. So I just wanted to reiterate that piece of it, because I think that is so, so important, and not what people think of when they think about a security team.
Right. Spot on.
Yeah. Good stuff. Okay. Okay, so to kind of switch gears just a little bit away from church planning, I was wondering if you would tell us a little bit about something I was reading about that looked very interesting on your website called the Celebration Seminar. Tell us about what that is, what topics you cover, who that intended audience is. Talk to us about Celebration Seminar.
Sure. So one of the real struggles, especially when I did a fair amount of family litigation, was I would have people coming in with needs, but that can get really expensive. That can get really time consuming. And so often it was a balancing of values of how much I could help that person. And so when COVID hit, Tennessee Supreme Court shut down. I was still considered essential, but the Tennessee Supreme Court shut down a lot of revenues because they were tied to court appearances. So they closed court. So what can I do from my office? And how can I serve this need that I have of being able to and dealing with my own codependency aside, and dealing with my own need to minister to people, how can I serve them and it not be a huge burden on me? And so I developed a workbook. It's an estate planning workbook. It's a very basic workbook. And it is for Tennessee, but it had just my basic powers of attorney in it, advanced care plan. And for Tennessee purposes, Tennessee accepts a holographic will, although they're getting harder and harder because nobody writes anymore. But, gave instructions for that. So if I had somebody who walked in and they looked at my regular rates and they said, no, I think that's too expensive, I can hand them a workbook and say, here you go. So from that came the seminar. Now the seminar is primarily geared toward churches, but not exclusively. And so basically the seminar is me walking people through that book. It was developed to be a free resource. My wife has encouraged me that I accept donations to cover the cost of producing the free resource. So we do that now, but it's still a free resource at the end of the day for people that say, well, we can't afford that. We don't have any other access to be able to, but we still want to leave a legacy of peace. We don't want to leave a legacy of chaos. And so how can we do that? And so they can go through that book. The powers of attorney just need to be notarized. The will can be handwritten. Honestly, it can be handwritten inside the book if they want to. The thing is that it has to be entirely handwritten. And so that's what that celebration is. And we discuss what it means to leave that legacy of peace. And generally, since I'm doing it from churches, I always ask for there to be a pastor there, because the first thing we talk about is, if true estate planning from my perspective is, where's your walk with the Lord? Beyond that, everything else is details. And so, and I'll encourage them. It's, even though I'm speaking to the choir, if you can't answer that question, here's one of the pastors. So that's the celebration.
That's great. I love that.
You do the presentation yourself.
Yes.
What I'm curious. I'm going to drill into that a little bit. What are the best times to do that? Is that a Saturday morning thing, a Thursday night thing, a Wednesday night thing?
That's a great question. I have done it on all of those. So I think at the end of the day, it depends on the culture of the church or the culture of the group. So, for example, the last one I did was actually on a Sunday morning after they finished service. Oh. I also, as a part of my speaking, I will do Social Security seminars. So what we have found works best on the Social Security seminars is a Tuesday and a Thursday night. We'll get more people in. We've done Saturday mornings and that sort of thing. So it depends on the culture of the group. But generally Tuesday and Thursday nights have been the best for us if it's something that we're going to send out any kind of advertising on.
Tuesday and Thursday nights?
Yes.
Okay. Good intel.
For sure.
Very interesting.
Sure.
Very.
Mm-hmm.
I think churches are a great venue for what we do, and I think it's really unusual to find people who've recognized that and have a model, have an approach for how to do that.
Right.
Yeah. So moving kind of along this same track, I'll ask you the big question. Through the work that you do, kind of in all of these different groups with these different people, what is it that you hope your legacy will be?
Well, like I said, I practice for my faith. So I hope that people see a true relational connection that I have with the Lord in working with them. And that does not mean religious. So let me separate that out clearly, because I have had clients, especially when I have done some criminal defense work, where I've had to speak their language, and a lot of church folk would be offended by it, but they had their own dialect, and I had to figure that out. And so I want people to see that, but also the fact that for me, my faith walk has really come back to the verse of, seeking out my own salvation with fear and trembling, which hasn't always matched people around me. So I want people to see that, but I also want the legacy to be that I supported my family, because in this, it is very, very easy to get wrapped up in free work. It's very, very easy to get wrapped up in something that's pro bono. And so I get a lot of warm and fuzzies out of that. But at the end of the day, my wife doesn't have a retirement. And so what I'm doing now allows me to do this. It allows me to serve clients in a much broader fashion. As much as I enjoy estate planning, I have some clients who are more served when I talk to them about all the options that they have for long-term care now. I had a client in the office the other day where she had moved into the state, so that prompted her being in my office. That was one of the things. But she had a financial professional, so a guy who had all of her money in the market at 80-something, an attorney, and in between all of those, she actually didn't have all of her Medicare in place, and nobody had asked her the question. And at 83, she was looking at substantial penalties because she didn't have a prescription drug plan, right? And so I like having more tools than just law in my toolbox to be able to serve those people and to have that sort of legacy. And I would really love to have more attorneys and CPAs who can have this sort of conversation because they've expanded those offerings beyond just what's in their silo.
That's great. Okay, follow-up question. If you could give our listeners one piece of advice that you have learned from your years of experience in all of these different things, what would that piece of advice be?
Whatever issue you're dealing with, whatever situation you're dealing with, especially if we're dealing with another person or a group of people, is I have learned the more you learn about them, the more you learn about their backstory, the more you're able to have empathy with their position. And so you may not agree with them. You may be using different words, honestly, to say the same thing, but it has gotten harder and harder as I have grown as a person, that when I understand the other side better, it has gotten harder and harder for me to really have much frustration with them. And coming from an attorney perspective, Stan, I think you'd probably resonate with this, is, often we have clients who come in that, they want to use us as the battering ram against the other side. And it's gotten harder and harder for me to do that. And it's not about bringing out facts, right? It's about grinding an axe on that other person that so often people expect attorneys to be, when at the end of the day, over and over again, I'm called to be a peacemaker. And whether I'm doing family law, criminal law, personal injury, or estate planning, it's a matter of getting people to a place of peace.
I love
I
that.
would absolutely underscore what you're describing. My experience confirms that 100%.
And Stan would really know Zale because he doesn't always bring this up, but for a brief time, he served as a divorce attorney. And for those listeners who may not know this about Stan, I need you guys to know that that did not work out well, because Stan is such an empathetic person that he did not do well as a divorce attorney because he kept getting all the couples back together.
I also found you can't get paid for that. So
Correct.
Right.
Yes. Yes. Not
Well,
not a lucrative career move.
well, and I think y'all will get a kick out of this. I have really one negative review online. And please don't anybody listen to that and grow that number. But I have one negative review online, and that has to do with somebody who called in. She wasn't even a client, called in, and I encouraged her on some things with regard to divorce and maybe not getting one and maybe attempting some reconciliation that did not go well for her. And so I got a negative review. What's interesting is I now have a client who came in because of that negative review, because I told her the straight story as opposed to just trying to generate fees.
Yeah, love it. Well, this has been very interesting and loved it. Is there anything else that you would like to tell our listeners about that we have not mentioned?
I think we've covered a lot of it, especially, one of the things that I'm going to kind of turn this back on both of y'all just a little bit. In looking at your website, one of the things that I appreciate about your group is not just talking about the legal side of legacy planning, but so, for example, on your website, there's a reference to annuities, which can be good. I know I just turned some people off, but understand there are good products out there, and I'll be happy to tell you about a few. But annuities, long-term care, long-term care has changed tremendously over the past 2 decades. And for the majority of my clients, the type of long-term care that they prefer to look at are the newer types, the types where you just don't, if you don't use it, you lose it. You get to, if you don't use it, it gets paid out to your family and that sort of thing. And so I think that's the biggest thing, is we have so many tools now when it comes to legacy planning, when it comes to being able to leave a legacy of peace, when it comes to retiring well. So often, and one of the things I appreciated about your site is many in our area of estate planning, they just look at, how can we get people onto Medicaid? Well, from my perspective, I grew up, and I honestly didn't remember this until, I don't know, a couple of months ago. I grew up in nursing home and assisted living facilities because my mom was an administrative assistant to the administrators. And so I've worked in high school, I worked in the assisted living facilities. I worked in nursing homes. And so for me, in looking at Medicaid, I don't see Medicaid as a plan. And I see Medicaid as how do we deal with that last ditch effort? And as I have added the insurance license, I actually have more tools for that now. When I was an attorney, I could just speak from the 10,000 foot view. Now I can get it down to the penny and show them different ways that they can make their money last longer. But at the end of the day, I think the biggest thing is being able to serve people well, and that may or may not be tied to a law license.
Very interesting.
This is, let me just underscore what you're saying. It is so true that, that as lawyers, we bring a lot of power tools, but we don't bring them all. And if we try to be the sole source of the answer, we're really missing out on this huge resource that's over here, that when you pair it up with what we do, it really can produce this, this amazing outcome.
Right.
And so you're definitely on the right track here.
Thank you.
Well, thanks everybody for listening. This has been the Legacy Leaders Podcast with Stan Miller and Katie Beth Hand. Our guest today was Zale Dowlen, and for more information about Zale and the work that he does, visit zaledowlen.com. You can also find him on Facebook or LinkedIn, and we'll include it in the show notes for you. Zale, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thanks, Katie Beth. Thanks, Stan.
You've been listening to the Legacy Leaders Podcast with Katie Beth Hand and Stan Miller. For more information on them and the show, please visit pinnaclelegacylaw.com. If you like what you've learned today, do share the program with your friends and subscribe wherever podcasts are found.